Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we are going to be looking into aviation safety and a recent tragedy, the crash of Jeju Air Flight 2216 in South Korea.
Yeah, a really heartbreaking incident, and there's a lot of kind of mystery surrounding the circumstances of the crash itself. The plane essentially belly flopped without its landing gear, skidded off the runway, and burst into
Right.
flames.
And only two of the 181 people on board survived. So there are a lot of questions swirling around this incident. And one of the things that early reports are suggesting is that a bird strike might have played a role.
Right.
So that's what we're going to be kind of looking into today. Could a bird strike really cause this type of catastrophic crash? And how common are bird strikes anyway? Is this something that we should all be worried about when we get on a plane?
Hmm.
Well, to help us unpack all of this, we've got an aviation expert with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So maybe a good place to start is just how common are bird strikes and how serious are the risks?
Well, it's important to understand that bird strikes, while potentially dangerous, are actually more frequent than you might think. The FAA recorded almost 20,000 bird strikes just in the U.S. alone last year.
20,000.
Wow.
So they're happening all the time.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that most of them don't actually result in a disaster.
No, exactly. It's kind of like if you think about driving a car, you're going to have little fender benders here and there, but a major accident is thankfully much less common.
Okay.
And the same principle applies to bird strikes. Data from the UK Civil Aviation Authority shows that less than 10% of bird strikes actually result in any kind of damage or disruption to flights.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
So let's get back to the Jeju air crash for a moment, because we know that the pilots did report hitting a flock of birds before they issued a Mayday call. So maybe just explain to the listener exactly what a Mayday call is.
Sure. So a Mayday call is an international distress signal used by aircraft and ships to signal a life-threatening emergency.
Right.
It's basically a way of saying we need immediate help.
So in this case, the pilots knew they were in serious trouble. They attempted an emergency landing, but as we know, something went very wrong.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that stand out to you about this particular crash? What are some of the unusual details?
Well, one of the things that immediately jumps out is that the plane's ADS-B data stopped transmitting shortly after the Mayday call. So ADS-B is essentially like the plane's location tracker.
Huh?
So it's unusual for that to just suddenly go offline.
So it's like the plane just sort of vanished from the radar.
In a way, yeah. Also, there are reports that the plane landed in the opposite direction of the runway and beyond the designated landing zone,
Right.
which is highly unusual. And there's no indication that the pilots deployed the flaps or the landing gear before touching down, which would be standard procedure in an emergency situation.
So it sounds like they had a pretty significant loss of control. But wouldn't you think that modern planes are designed to withstand a bird strike? Why would this one be so catastrophic?
That's a great question, and it kind of gets to the complex nature of aviation accidents. It's not always a single cause.
Right.
While aircraft are designed to handle bird strikes to a certain degree, the severity of the impact depends on a number of factors. The size and the species of the bird, the speed and the altitude of the aircraft, the point of impact, even the skill of the pilots.
Right.
It all kind of comes into play.
So are we saying that the bird strike might have been like the initial trigger that then set off a whole chain of events that ultimately led to the crash?
It's definitely a possibility, and that's why investigations into these incidents are so thorough and complex. Investigators need to piece together all the available evidence. The flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, eyewitness accounts, physical evidence from the crash site to try to determine the sequence of events and identify all the contributing factors.
Right. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I found really interesting was this idea that modern aircraft engines are actually quieter than older models.
Mhm.
And I guess I never really thought about it before, but could that actually make planes more susceptible to bird strikes?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of unintended consequence of trying to make air travel quieter for us humans. Quieter engines mean that birds might not hear the planes coming until it's too late to avoid them.
Right. So it's quieter for people on the ground, but potentially more dangerous for birds in the air.
Exactly. And this is leading some experts to question if we've unintentionally made our planes more dangerous to birds in the name of noise reduction.
That's a fascinating point. So it sounds like there's a lot more to this bird strike issue than meets the eye.
Definitely.
And we're going to dig into some of those broader implications in just a minute.
Yeah.
But first, I want to get back to the specifics of the Jeju air crash and look at what the experts are saying about it. What are some of the unanswered questions that are still out there?
Well, as the investigation unfolds, we'll hopefully get a much clearer understanding of what happened in those final moments of the flight and whether a bird strike alone can really explain such a devastating outcome.
Right, and we'll talk about that more when we come back.
One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we look at these kinds of incidents is that aviation experts are often divided in their opinions about what happened. And we can actually see that playing out in this case.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's an Al Jazeera article that quotes two different experts. One is Jeffrey Thomas, who's the editor-in-chief of Airline Ratings, and he believes that the bird strike was definitely a factor, but likely not the only cause. He suggests that there might have been a series of what he called cascading failures.
Cascading failures.
Hmm.
What does that mean?
So it's this idea that one small problem can trigger a whole chain of events that leads to a much bigger failure. Like, think of it like dominoes falling one after another. So in this case, the bird strike might have damaged some critical system, which then set off a chain reaction of other failures that ultimately overwhelmed the pilots. Thomas also points out that the pilots didn't follow some key landing procedures. So that adds another layer of complexity to the whole investigation.
Yeah, so it's possible that the bird strike maybe created this domino effect that led to those other issues rather than each issue being entirely separate.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important in aviation to have redundancy built into the systems.
Right.
Planes have multiple engines, backup systems, emergency procedures, all to prevent a single point of failure from leading to a catastrophe.
Right. So what does the other expert think?
Well, the other expert, Doug Drury, who is from CQ University in Australia, he's much more skeptical that a bird strike alone could have caused this crash.
Right.
He says that a modern aircraft like the Boeing 737-800 should be able to withstand a bird strike without, suffering this kind of complete loss of control.
Right.
He points to other incidents where planes have safely landed after bird strikes. Like, you probably remember the Miracle on the Hudson incident.
Oh, yeah, with Sully Sullenberger.
Right, where he landed that plane full of passengers in the Hudson River after a bird strike.
It's amazing he was able to do that.
It was incredible. And I think that also highlights how important pilot training is in these situations.
Right, they have to be prepared to deal with anything.
Absolutely. Pilots undergo very rigorous training to handle all kinds of emergencies, including bird strikes. So they learn how to assess the damage, how to maintain control of the aircraft, and how to make really critical decisions under pressure.
Right, so Drury is basically saying that the Jeju Air pilots should have been able to land that plane safely, even after hitting those birds. But what else is he questioning about this crash?
Well, he brings up a really interesting point about the airport itself and the lack of certain safety precautions. Specifically, he questions why Muran International Airport didn't have any kind of bird deterrent systems in place, like sound cannons, which are pretty common at airports to scare birds away.
Yeah, you would think that would be like a basic safety measure, given that balloon strikes are a known risk.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. We actually found a report from a South Korean newspaper, the Chosun Daily, that says environmental impact assessments for Muan Airport actually recommended these deterrents. Like, they were supposed to have sound cannons, lasers, warning lights, the whole 9 yards. But for some reason, those plans were delayed.
Oh, wow.
They were in the middle of some runway work, and those extra safety measures hadn't been implemented yet.
So that's really unfortunate, especially if those precautions could have made a difference in this case.
It really makes you think about the shared responsibility between airlines and airports when it comes to preventing bird strikes.
Right. Everyone needs to be doing their part to make sure that flying is as safe as possible.
It's a complex issue, for sure. And this crash really highlights the need for a kind of multi-layered approach to bird strike prevention. We're talking about aircraft design, airport safety protocols, pilot training, all of these things working together.
So if we zoom out for a moment, what are some of the other strategies that airports can use to prevent bird strikes? Is it all about just scaring them away with loud noises and lights?
Well, there's actually a whole science behind it. It's called airport wildlife management.
Okay.
And it involves understanding bird behavior, monitoring bird populations, and then implementing a whole range of techniques to basically make the airport less attractive to birds.
So it's not as simple as just, putting up some scarecrows and hoping for the best.
No, not at all. It's really about making the airport environment less appealing to birds in the first place. So they'll do things like removing potential food sources, eliminating any standing water, keeping the glass cut really short to reduce nesting opportunities.
So it's like they're trying to discourage the birds from even hanging out around the airport in the first place.
Exactly. And then, of course, they also use those more active deterrents that we talked about, like the pyrotechnics, propane cannons, lasers, all those sorts of things to actively scare birds away.
Right.
And some airports have even started using trained falcons and hawks to patrol the airfields.
Really? Like falconry at the airport?
Yeah, it's actually a thing.
Right.
And it's surprisingly effective. But at the end of the day, it's all about managing the risk, not trying to eliminate it completely.
Right.
Because birds are part of the natural environment, and you can't really expect to have an airport that exists in some kind of completely sterile bubble.
Right. You have to find a way to coexist.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between safety and, the reality of the natural world.
Okay, so turning back to the Jeju air crash for a moment,
Mm.
how has South Korea responded to this tragedy?
Well, it's definitely a nation in mourning. The
Hmm.
government declared 7 days of national mourning flags are flying at half-mast, and the acting president visited the crash site to pay respects. And beyond the immediate response, authorities are working hard to identify the victims' remains, which I'm sure is an incredibly difficult process for the families.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what they're going through right now.
That's just heartbreaking. But the government is also taking steps to try to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. They've ordered special inspections of all the Boeing 737-800s that operate in the country,
Okay.
which is the same model as the plane that crashed. And the acting president has ordered a sweeping review of the entire aviation sector to see if there are any systemic weaknesses that need to be addressed.
So it sounds like they're really taking this seriously and trying to learn from this tragedy.
Yeah, I think they're very committed to making sure that flying is as safe as possible for everyone. And I think that really speaks to a broader point about aviation safety as a whole.
Okay, what's that?
It's an ongoing process. It's not like we reach some point where we say, okay, everything's perfect. We don't need to do anything else.
It's always evolving.
Exactly. We're constantly learning from these incidents, whether they're near misses or major accidents.
Hmm.
And we use that knowledge to make improvements to our procedures, our technologies, our training, everything.
So it's always about adapting and getting better.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that these crashes are very rarely caused by just one single thing.
Okay.
It's almost always a combination of factors,
Right.
mechanical issues, pilot decisions, weather conditions, airport safety protocols like we've been talking about.
There's never just one simple answer.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes aviation safety such a complex and challenging field.
Well, it's good to know that the industry is always striving to improve and keep people safe.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the world of bird strikes and aviation safety. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully you learned a thing or two about what it takes to keep our skies safe. Until next time, safe travels, everyone.